Hello, this is Chris Browder. Um, this is lesson 9. We're talking about social factors and how they influence second language acquisition. This is part 3 of lesson 9. We're moving into theories that view SLA as a social process, moving beyond what we already have discussed in previous lessons. This lesson is largely based on Rod Ellis's text, Understanding Second Language Acquisition, or Ortega's text, Understanding Second Language Acquisition, Seville Trigg's text, Introducing Second Language Acquisition. In lessons 7 and 8, we discussed Krashen's monitor model, and we learned how this has become one of the most influential SLA theories of all. But after this discussion of social factors, you can probably already see that Krashen's monitor model doesn't do much to take social factors into account. Krashen's model views social factors solely as the environment that provides the input and influences the effective filter. Long's interaction hypothesis and Swain's output hypothesis, in contrast, were able to see how interactive communication with others facilitated certain learning processes. In these two popular hypotheses, the social context was valued as making a positive contribution by stimulating, triggering and facilitating certain cognitive processes for language acquisition. But they still continue to view the learning process as a process inside the learner. Let's contrast this with sociocultural theory. Sociocultural theory values the social aspects of second language acquisition much more than these other theories. Sociocultural theory is a school of thought that views learning as a social process instead of an internal process or cognitive or neurological process inside the mind of the learner. The most famous name from sociocultural theory is Lev Vygotsky. He was a Russian psychologist from the 1930s. Vygotsky believed people learn more with the help of others than they do when trying to learn alone. He referred to this expanded learning potential as the zone of proximal development, or ZPD. Thus, ZPD is not a physical space, it's an additional learning potential. To understand this idea, let's apply it to the theories that we already know. So let's take Krashen's input hypothesis, for example. As you recall, Krashen asserted that people learn when they understand L2 input that is slightly higher than their current level. And he referred to that type of input as I+1 input. Essentially, when someone helps a language learner by making the I+1 comprehensible, the help is the learning, and the +1 is the zone of proximal development. So this is a different way of thinking. So the help that's being provided is the learning. It's external. The +1 is the learning that wouldn't take place without the help. That's the zone of proximal development. Long's interaction hypothesis can similarly be interpreted through Vygotsky's theories. Long believed people engaged in strategies when communicating with English learners, and he referred to these communicative strategies as the negotiation of meaning. Long believed that the negotiation of meaning helped learners acquire languages faster by making input comprehensible and providing information about the language, such as what works and what doesn't work. One example of the negotiation of meaning would be a confirmation check. The following is an example of a confirmation check. So if Sarah says, "I didn't see you in class last night," Johan says, "I work." Sarah says, "Oh, you were working last night." Vygotsky would explain that the learner in this situation learns faster because someone is helping him. Notice that the other person is not necessarily trying to help him learn. She's only trying to communicate and make sure she understands him, but in the process, she provides him with the grammar form that he needed to use and that he's probably developmentally ready to acquire. In this case, the grammar form is the ZPD. And again, we see that the learning process takes place outside the learner. This is confusing because normally in our culture, we think of learning as something that takes place inside the mind or the brain of the learner, such as a change in cognition or the creation of a neural network. I think that Vygotsky would argue that the change is the end result of learning, but not the actual process of the learning. Now, you could say that this is just a semantic difference of how you define learning, but yeah, basically, this is important to understanding Vygotsky. The learning is the activity that takes place outside the learner that results in the change in cognition or building of neural networks. The change in cognition or the building of neural networks is not the learning. It's the result. Vygotsky uses his concept of mediation to explain this learning for us a little better and help us understand. In mediation, humans learn culturally constructed artifacts, concepts, or activities to regulate and train mental activities. So a teacher in a classroom, for instance, uses a curriculum, a textbook, a lesson plan, a projector, a presentation, and a whiteboard to teach your students math. All those things are, even the math, are culturally constructed artifacts that help the students learn. So what's the actual learning? Is it the math? No. Math is also a set of culturally constructed concepts and activities. So when you're learning math, you're really actually doing math. You're not really learning math. You are using math to mediate your cognition, regulate your cognition, establish neural networks. Your math is something that your culture invented and you're using it to control your brain. The learning is the use of all these things to regulate and train mental activities. The eventual change in cognition or neural networks is the result of the process, and the process is social. It's not an individual process. At this point, you must surely be asking, surely a person can learn something by himself, right? And I don't think Vygotsky would disagree with that. But so, for example, let's get into this. You can learn a language all by yourself, supposedly, using Rosetta Stone or Duolingo. You can learn about existentialism by listening to a podcast, right? Yeah, you can learn about SLA by watching this video. Supposedly, I've heard you can learn how to build an atomic bomb by watching videos on YouTube, right? But ask yourself, aren't all these forms of media for learning also just culturally constructed artifacts? For that matter, the language even isn't the language, the philosophy, the science also culturally constructed concepts and activities? Everything that you're learning is culturally constructed concepts and activities. In other words, even when you are alone, it is still mediation because you're using the products of human societies to learn. So that you basically, you're not learning those products. You are using those products or engaging those products in order to regulate your cognition and build neural networks. Okay. So Now, somebody out there must be saying, well, what about a guy who's all alone on an island? So if you crash and you're on a deserted island all alone, and you need to learn how to open up a coconut by smashing it against a rock, surely, I mean, that how could that be mediation? Because you're so outside of society. You're learning how to do something on your own. Nobody's helping you. There's no YouTube video, there's no textbook or anything like that, right? Where are the culturally constructed artifacts, concepts, or activities when you're opening that coconut? I think to explain this situation, Vygotsky would argue that the man brought the tools of mediation with him to the island. So even if he doesn't actually have a physical tool like a knife, he already knows how to use human tools like hammers and knives to accomplish tasks. And he realizes that the rock is a tool. He is applying a culturally constructed concept he learned from outside the island when he uses the sharp rock as a tool. In fact, he was probably also talking to himself while doing it, which means that basically he's using language to think through the problem. He's talking to himself, and yes, language is also a tool of mediation. So, in other words, when you're talking to yourself, whether it's out loud or even if it's inside your head, you're thinking something through, you're using language to mediate your cognition. And the language is something that you and your culture created collectively. So, according to Vygotsky, our language is a tool of mediation. In fact, he would argue that it is the most important tool of all for mediation because not only do we use it to help each other learn, but we even use it inside of our head when we think. And he called this inner speech. This kind of, I find it relates to the idea of rehearsal and information processing. You know, they would argue that you kind of run it over in your head, you think it through in your head, and that you're often talking it through in your head to yourself. Yeah. So let's recap. Learning is a social process. It's not an individual product. The resulting change in cognition or neural networks is the result of that process. The process of learning is mediation. Mediation is when humans support their learning using culturally constructed artifacts, concepts, and activities to facilitate the cognitive or neurological change. We shouldn't view this process as something that happens one learner at a time. Instead, we should view this learning as a collective process, something that involves the whole society cooperating to create new culture. One application of Vygotsky's idea for teachers is the process of scaffolding. According to Vygotsky, scaffolding is when one person helps a learner by supporting them to do something that they cannot do independently. An example of scaffolding in a classroom would be providing language learners with a list of words, like a word wall, or sentence stems, something that they could be using. So if you're providing all that support to help them write a paragraph, that's scaffolding, because maybe they can't write the paragraph on their own, but if you provide the list of words and the sentence stems and the structure, and help them to do it, and maybe even talk them through it, yeah, that's all scaffolding. The idea is that it helps the learner complete the task, but the learner will eventually be able to write the paragraph without the support, eventually, if he does it enough times with the teacher. It's not such a lofty concept. It's just common sense. I mean, it's scaffolding and Vygotsky. It sounds, really big, right? But really, it's just like using training wheels when you're learning how to ride a bike, or using water wings when you're learning how to swim. Those are culturally constructed objects and practices that you're using to regulate or mediate your change in cognition or neural networks. All right. Let's talk about cooperative and collaborative learning. These are also applications of Vygotsky. With these two similar practices, the teacher stops being viewed as the source of learning, and the students as receptacles that she's pouring her knowledge into. Collaborative and cooperative learning view learning as a social activity and believe learners can support one another even if they're all at the same level. So you don't have to have an expert helping you learn. A group of people can learn together. Merrill Swain adopted Vygotsky's notion of mediation for SLA with her idea of languaging. Languaging is when people use language for mediation. Learners use language to help them process or make sense of something, and that's languaging. Which is, what that's just, teaching and learning, right? That's what we think of as teaching and learning. Somebody's talking to you, explaining something, but also learners talk through something or think aloud. They're thinking aloud or they're thinking to themselves, right? They're using language in their head to work something out. Notice that this languaging, it isn't something that teachers do to the students, so it's not lecturing. It's something that students do to themselves or do with other students. Notice the processing has to occur for it to be real languaging. Okay, the change in cognition has to occur in order for it to be languaging. So if a teacher is lecturing to students and is using language, but there's no processing, then it's not languaging. Languaging is active, languaging is not passive, and languaging is driven by the learners themselves, not by the teachers. Swain developed this concept by watching students work in groups to complete L2 activities such as writing tasks. She observed that students used language to help each other and that this often involved a discussion about the language and its rules or features. As a result, the students working in groups were able to produce higher level writing samples collectively than each one of them would be able to produce individually. And as a result, after doing this, they all, regardless of their level, the high level learners and the low level learners, all were able to produce higher level writing individually later on. Swain also observed that students completing these tasks in groups often resorted to the use of their L1 to discuss how to best complete the L2 task. In other words, they were ordered to, talk to each other in English to figure out how to best write the paragraph or complete the worksheet or whatever. But when the teacher walked away, they started talking to each other in Spanish or whatever. And actually, I guess with Swain, it'd be French, right? So this activity or phenomena is now commonly referred to as translanguaging. Notice translanguaging is not translating. So translanguaging, again, is when the students are languaging in the L2 in order to facilitate their collective learning of the L1. Please note, however, that a teacher lecturing to students about an L2 using the L1 is not translanguaging. Okay, so although use of the students' L1 in language classes has long been discouraged for many, many decades, even considered to be the bane of English learning, experts are now widely recognizing the benefits of translanguaging, of allowing the students to work it through or talk it through in their first language, and make comparisons or whatever. Note that Vygotsky's sociocultural theory of learning describes learning as an activity that a society does together instead of concerning itself with how one expert, such as a teacher, pours his knowledge into a learner, such as a student. So I guess in a nutshell, this is just a very revolutionary way of thinking of teaching and learning that's very different from the way Our schools have been run in the United States for a long time. Let's talk about conversation analysis, or what we call CA-SLA. Legitimate peripheral participation. Jean Lev and Etienne Wegner were interested, like Vygotsky, in how groups of people share or create new knowledge and culture. They refer to these groups of people who share knowledge and culture as communities of practice, because these groups are identified and united by the common practices they share. In particular, Lev and Wegner were interested in how a person who is new to the group becomes a member of that group by acquiring its knowledge and culture. Their idea of situated learning, or legitimate peripheral participation, attempts to describe that process. So, in other words, an outsider tries to join that group of people who have that common practice. In this process, learning is not a change in cognition, neurology, or behavior, but it is the process of becoming a member of a community of practice. Notice how this idea incorporates both Vygotsky's sociocultural theory and Schumann's acculturation model. Groups use their culture to create and share new culture. Outsiders learning that culture are not simply acquiring the knowledge, they are in fact acculturating or learning to become valued members of the new community. Conversation analysis, or what we're going to call CA-SLA, it's a method, not a teaching method. It's a method of ethnographic research that tries to understand this social process that Lev and Wegner described. They study how the interactions that happen in common everyday events are actually part of this process. So let's look at an example of this. So let's say that Phil is a US citizen visiting Britain, and Susan is British, and they're talking to each other. And then Phil says, "Would you like some chips?" And he's holding a bag of what we call potato chips. Susan, who's British, says, well, first she looks confused, right? She sees the bag of potato chips, and she smiles and she says, "Oh, yeah, crisps. Sure, Phil, I'd love some." In this case, Phil is an outsider learning to socially participate in British culture. He uses the US word chips. Susan helps him participate more appropriately by offering the British word crisps. In this way, Susan is helping Phil acquire her language and culture without being a teacher per se, and Phil is becoming a member of the community of practice. That community in this situation is people who use British English instead of US English. In other words, the community he's joining, and notice he's joining that community by participating in that community. And it's the community of people who say crisps instead of chips. Notice that this idea is very similar to Long's idea of negotiation of meaning. CA people call this learning in action. You learn to be a member of a community by participating in that community. And nobody has to explicitly teach you anything. They just have to basically welcome you and try to be inclusive. So let's recap. We've covered a lot of ground here. Okay, so in this lesson so far, we started by talking about cognitivists who believe that learning is a change in cognition, but they acknowledge that the environment is an important influence. Then we talked about social linguistics. These people believe language learning is very dependent on acculturation. Learners who acculturate more learn more. We got into Vygotsky. Vygotsky's sociocultural theory took it one step further. Vygotsky believed that cognitive change is not the actual learning. Vygotsky believed that learning is a social process that takes place outside the learner that results in the cognitive change. Then we moved into CA. Conversation analysis is very interested in learning as a social process, and they try to understand it by looking at these language events. They try to understand how this process takes place in everyday interactions instead of formal instruction. They conclude that learning a second language involves learning how to participate in and eventually become a valued member of a group that uses that target language. In other words, interaction in a second language is socialization into the group that uses the language. That brings us into Norton's social identity theory. Like these other theories, social identity theory seeks to understand how second language acquisition is a social process, but in social identity theory, a learner doesn't just participate in or gain membership to a group that uses the target language. In social identity theory, language acquisition actually involves the construction of a new identity. Bonnie Norton defines identity as the relationship between an individual and a society. For language learners, identity is the relationship between the learner and the other people who are using the target language in any specific situation. So please note that this does not mean that when we learn a new language, we lose our original identity. And it also does not mean that our new identity will be based completely on our relationship to all native speakers of the target language in all situations. Instead, it's like you are trying to participate in one situation, and that participation involves you having a relationship with that situation and those people, and that is an identity. Similar to conversation analysis's notion of language learning as participation, Norton argues that our identity is constantly being negotiated during our participation in social contexts. For this reason, identity is constantly in flux. It's not static. Second language learners, however, may find themselves interacting with multiple groups, and their language proficiency influences the outcomes of those interactions. So in that way, L2 language identity is dynamic and it's multiple. So you could have multiple different situations and you play a role or identity in one of those situations. And as you gain proficiency, the way you interact in that situation changes, and therefore your identity changes. L2 learners may draw from different identities and choose the one that is best for the current situation. Kind of like putting on a mask. But one identity can sometimes conflict with another, and sometimes our choices are limited by power relationships. Moreover, changes in identity afford changes in opportunity. Norton believed that learners choose to create L2 identities in part because they want those opportunities. She refers to this as investment. In other words, you choose to invest the time and energy to learn the language because you think you're going to get something out of it. But what you're getting is a new identity, and that identity has maybe, let's say, more power or more opportunities, and that's attractive to you. So let's take a look at some of Norton's social identity theory in action. Let's say that a newly arrived immigrant English learner gets a job at McDonald's here in the US. If he doesn't know much English and all the other workers speak only English, then he's going to have a hard time participating in their conversations and social exchanges. Now, this is interesting. A lot of people don't realize it, but sometimes these immigrant learners are actually very educated individuals. They could be very educated, they could be very intellectual. Um, they could have been, doctors or lawyers in their own country, but now they're, stacking shelves at Walmart. Yes, sadly, I've seen that. So this guy, let's say if he's very educated and intellectual in his first language, but now he's working at McDonald's and he doesn't really know English. So the best he can do is maybe one word answers, maybe some goofy sight gags. He can use some gestures and some facial expressions. So sadly, his new identity is now a bit goofy and childish, not educational or intellectual at all. So choosing to participate in these workplace interactions is a bit of an ego threat to him. What exactly does he get out of interacting with these other workers at McDonald's after all? He has to have a high self-esteem to overcome that threat to his ego. Basically, he has to know who he really is when he plays those roles, when he takes on this new identity. And he has to decide whether it's worth his time at all to even bother to try to have a social relationship with these people. Like, what does he get out of it? So investment for this man means choosing to participate and struggling to establish an identity that he can be comfortable with. Maybe he can eventually learn enough English to express his thoughts and discuss complicated issues. So maybe, if he works really hard, he can learn how to speak English and have these intellectual conversations that he craves. But he's working at McDonald's. Are his coworkers even the type of people who can have interesting conversations? Let's look at another example. Let's say a woman immigrates from a country with very strict and oppressive gender roles for women. Her husband wants her to stay at home and take care of the kids. That's what she's supposed to do. She's supposed to be a good mother. That's her priority. That's her family's priority. That's her culture's priority. But one day, she has to attend a parent-teacher conference for the child. And at this conference, she realizes she can now help her child better if she learns English. In other words, being a good mother means learning English. So she starts imagining herself speaking English someday, and she starts imagining how proud she will be to help her family. But first, she has to convince her husband to let her take English classes at night. That means he has to stay home and watch the child. So suddenly, her desire to learn English creates a conflict with her first language identity and the gender roles that are played in her home. Now imagine that she gets permission to take those English classes, and the teacher expects her to participate in speaking activities, right? Because you can't learn to speak unless you speak. But this is a woman who comes from a culture where she's not supposed to speak. So this could also come in conflict with her traditional values and gender roles. In other words, just participating in English class means kind of creating an alternative identity. But what if she actually succeeds in learning English? What if she learns that she can express her opinions in English where she couldn't express it in her own language? What if she starts expressing her opinions and even disagreeing with the opinions of older men in class? What if she finds this liberating and empowering? The result is that now she has two different identities, and those two are in conflict, and one is winning. She might even end up going back to school, getting a college degree, and even becoming a teacher or something. This could result in a whole new life for her with new friends and independence and power, her own bank account and stuff like that, right? But notice that the whole process for her could be derailed if somebody just simply says, no, you're not allowed to take English classes. So power is very important in Norton's theories. So notice here that this phenomenon Norton describes harkens back to Dornier's theories of motivation. Right? Do you remember Dornier's, what was it called? The motivational self theory, right? Second language learners struggle to establish identities for themselves based on these visions they have. So they have this vision of their future self. If they can imagine a future self that they find motivating, then they will choose to invest, that's Norton's term, invest in making that vision into a reality. But Norton complicates this further by showing us that the investment often involves conflict and sacrifice, sometimes even humiliation, loss of status. And they're going to be they might be stopped. Somebody with more power can stop them from fulfilling their vision. So equity applications. So we might not have like real good teaching applications for this CA-SLA and social identity theory. We don't really have good teaching applications. Like with Vygotsky, we can have something like scaffolding and collaborative learning and cooperative learning and translanguaging and languaging and all that kind of stuff. So how do we have a practical application for Bonnie Norton's idea? Well, let's say it has what we call equity application. So to make the learning process more equitable, proponents of social identity theory and CA-SLA suggest that we identify and eliminate certain power imbalances that exist in second language learning situations. For example, they ask us to consider eliminating the dichotomy between native speaker and non-native speaker. They argue that the monolingual native speaker has no more right to own the language than the non-native speaker, that becoming just like the monolingual native speaker and speaking English like a native speaker shouldn't be the goal. They argue that the goal should not be for the L2 learners to become like native speakers, but instead should be to form an identity in the language that empowers them. For this reason, they encourage the formation of multilingual transnational identities and transnational communities of multilingual people instead of trying to assimilate into native speaker groups and struggle to earn their respect. Notice how now we've come full circle to theories of integrative motivation, acculturation, and assimilation. Social identity theory addresses some of the issues raised by these previous theories and gives both language teachers and learners a direction to go in. A practical application, like a teaching method? No. But a different view of the world that's kinder, more equitable? Yeah. All right. I hope this video was useful and interesting to you. Thanks a lot for joining me today. Goodbye.